Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to graft your knitting the easy way. So, grafting is kind of a seaming slash joining technique that we use anytime we want to take a live row of stitches and connect that to another live row of stitches. So this is often done at the toe of a sock. This is often used in infinity scarves if you want to graft the top edge of your knitting to the cast-on edge if you use a provisional cast-on, which once you remove the provisional cast-on, you get a live row of stitches. So we use this technique to seamlessly and invisibly join two live rows of stitches together. And once it's finished, it looks completely invisible as long as you have the tension right, which you can adjust as you go if you need to. So I have two little swatches here, and I have just put them both on the same needle. But normally when we would graft these two pieces together, we would basically take this one, turn it upside down, and graft this row of live stitches to this row of live stitches. And I'll show you more about how we're going to set that up in a minute. But normally we would have two pieces of knitting, or two halves of a tube if you wanted to graft the end of a tube closed. We would have two pieces of knitting on two different needles held in front of each other like this. So pretend this swatch was sitting on this front needle right here. And normally to graft two pieces of knitting together, we would use something called Kitchener stitch. And we would take our yarn needle and our working yarn, and we would go through a series of stitching in and out of the stitches that are on both of these needles to join them together. And this is not like terribly difficult, but it is kind of confusing, especially for beginners, because there's like this whole little chant that you have to try to remember which stitch to pick up next and which direction you're supposed to insert your needle from and all of that. And it can be kind of daunting, especially if you've never done it before. So what we're going to do is we're going to graft these two pieces of knitting together, and we're going to use a different method than the Kitchener stitch. So the method I'm going to show you is kind of my own way that I like to do it. It accomplishes the exact same thing as the Kitchener stitch. It's just a different way of going about it so that it is a lot easier to figure out and easier to remember how to do it. It's not as difficult on the brain. It's less confusing. So like I said, this second swatch would be on this needle, and I would hold them up against each other and stitch the two rows of live stitches together if we were doing it with Kitchener stitch. Instead, I'm going to put the swatches onto a piece of waste yarn to hold them on the waste yarn, and then we can really see what we're doing a lot better, and it just makes it a lot less complicated. So I'm going to take my yarn needle, and I am going to pick up the stitches off the needle as if to purl. So I am not inserting my needle as if I were knitting. I'm just inserting the needle all the way across in the same direction the needle is going. I'm not resituating any of the stitches. I am just sliding them onto the yarn needle. So I'm going to do that for both of these swatches. And it is now held on this piece of waste yarn. So now what we're going to do is, that's our first swatch. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with the second swatch, slip it off onto the waste yarn, and normally you would have this on two separate pieces of waste yarn, but since these are just swatches and since I am doing two separate pieces, I'm going to just slide them all onto one piece of waste yarn. But if you were doing a provisional cast on where you graft the top end of your knitting to the bottom end, then you would use the provisional cast on to get a piece of waste yarn through your live stitches at the bottom of the work, and then we would go from there. So this method of grafting does not involve any knitting needles, and it allows us to see what we're doing a lot better. So, as I have mentioned, I am doing this as a demonstration swatch, and this is not a real project. And normally, if we were to graft, I would go ahead and take the working yarn that's coming off of this swatch and use it for the grafting. And as long as you're using the yarn that matches both of your pieces, or at least one of your pieces, then this will be completely invisible. It will just look like another row of knitting. But I am going to use a contrast color yarn for this so that you can see what I'm doing better. But if we were to graft with the yarn that's coming off of the piece, you want it to be 2 to 3 times longer than the width of the section that you're grafting. So triple this width right here. That's how long you want to leave for a tail, and I like to leave a little bit more than that just in case. But you want at least 2 to 3 times long tail. The tail should be 2 to 3 times longer than the width of your piece that you're grafting. So since I'm not using the working yarn for this, I'm just going to leave it there. I'm going to use a strand of scrap yarn or waste yarn to graft my pieces because this is just a demonstration and you can see it better when I am using a yarn that does not match. So I have my yarn threaded onto my needle. And I should mention that if we were doing this as like the toe of a sock where you graft the end of a tube closed, if you have a tube that goes like this, it works the same way. You just want to kind of bring the edges out kind of more like that. You want to bring them together in opposing directions so that you can see it better. But it works the same way if you're doing this for a tube. You can also do this to graft the ends of a tube together. So if this was a whole tube and this was a whole tube, I could graft those together as well. So first of all, we need to understand how our knitting is constructed. By the way, this works best with stockinette stitch because that is what the grafting gives you, is a row of stockinette stitch. You can do rows of grafting in pattern, but it's a whole lot more complicated. And for now, we're just going to do it with the stockinette. So we need to understand kind of the structure of the stockinette fabric. And if you haven't seen my video on how to read your knitting, I actually have 2 videos on that. You want to go ahead and watch that if you don't know how to read your knitting, because that is kind of important. And that will help you with the grafting. That will help make it significantly easier. So we just want to keep in mind that we have basically a row of loops on both sides here, and we want to connect that row of loops. So we are going to be creating another row of knitting in between these two pieces to hold them together. So you also need to know that when we do this, if we graft 2 straight pieces of knitting together, it's going to be a half a stitch off. So it's going to be kind of shifted by half of a stitch to one side or the other. This is usually not very noticeable unless you're doing like super huge bulky yarn. But as long as your grafting is, of good tension, then that little half a stitch on the edge won't really show as long as you finish, you weave in your tails well and everything. So we don't have to worry about that as far as trying to make it match the edge, have the edges line up just perfectly, because they won't. But it will offset your pieces just a tiny little bit when we graft them together. So don't expect to do some kind of fancy stitch pattern and have it flow perfectly into the next piece, because it will be a half of a stitch offset. So in that case, if you're using a fancy stitch pattern, I would recommend just separating it with a little bit of stockinette stitch on each side, graft it together, and then you just have like a little decorative band of stockinette in between your fancy stitches. So here is my waste yarn, and now we're going to start doing the grafting. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at each loop on our waste yarn. So the loop kind of comes up and then goes back down in the same place. We're going to be doing the same thing. So the first step, we kind of have to do a little bit of a setup, which is really not that hard to do. So on the bottom piece, or the closer piece to me, I'm going to come up through that very first loop with my yarn needle. Now, you don't want your loop to be twisted. You don't want it to go like this so that the strands cross at the bottom, because that's a twisted stitch. So because we're just doing regular stockinette stitch and it should not be twisted if it's ordinary stockinette, we want our stitches to be untwisted when we graft them. So I'm going to bring my needle up through the first stitch on my waste yarn. I'm going to leave a tail. Normally, like I said, if you were doing this for real, you would use the yarn that's connected to your project, and there would be no need to leave a tail. But for demonstration's sake, I'm going to leave a tail just so that it doesn't come out. And so I've come up through the first stitch on this side. Now I'm going to go back to the second piece. And we also want to make sure that those stitches are not twisted. So we're going to go down through the first stitch and up through the second one. Okay, now ignore the waste yarn that is holding those stitches because that is not going to have any effect. The way the waste yarn goes through has no effect on our grafting stitches. So now I'm going to come back here to this first piece, and I'm going to look at the next, the stitch that I just went through the first time. So the stitch that my yarn came out of the last time I stitched through this piece, I'm going to go down through that stitch and up through the next one, okay? So that's what that looks like. Of course, the waste yarn is going to go through it in a different way than what we're stitching, but that doesn't matter. Ignore the waste yarn. You can even do the waste yarn in a different color that does not match your seaming yarn, which I actually recommend. And it's also a good idea to use a waste yarn that is either very smooth, like a cotton crochet thread or something like that, especially if you're doing something where it collects a lot of lint. Your yarn for your project does, because when you go to pull that waste yarn out, you don't want to leave a bunch of fuzz goop from the waste yarn stuck in your stitches. We'll have to pick it out. So use a smooth waste yarn if you want it to come out easily. So now I'm going to come back up to the second piece. Here's the stitch I went through the last time, the last stitch that I came out of on this top piece. I'm going to go down through that stitch and up through the next one. All right, now I'm going to come back to the bottom piece down here. Here's the stitch that I came out of the last time. I'm going to go down through that stitch and up through the next one, again making sure they are not twisted. So this really isn't as hard as it sounds when you're actually doing it, because we're just going down through the stitch we came out of the last time, up through the next one. Then we're going to come back over here, go down through the stitch we came out of the last time, and up through the next one. So as you can see so far, we are creating a row of knitting in between these two pieces with the brighter green yarn here. So the important thing that I mentioned with the tension is you want to make sure that you don't have your grafting stitches too loose or too tight, because if they are, then it won't blend seamlessly. It'll look like it's bunched, or it'll look like it's loose and sloppy. So just every few knit stitches that you make it through, you just want to go through and kind of look at them a little bit and make sure that they are even and that they are about the same size as the stitches in your knitting. So again, I'm going to come back to this piece up here, go down through the stitch I came out of the last time, and up through the next one. Come back over here, down through the stitch I came out of the last time, and up through the next one. So even though the loops are sitting sideways on the waste yarn, we want to just kind of flatten them out and ignore the waste yarn as if it wasn't there. But as long as you are making sure your stitches aren't twisted, this is a very simple process. Again, I'm going to go back to this piece and go down through the stitch I came out of the last time, up through the next one, come to this piece, go down through the stitch I came out of before, and up through the next one. And this really isn't that hard to do at all, and you can see our knitting is getting joined together with this green row, or the darker, brighter green row. And as long as your tension is even and the stitches are the same size as the rest of your knitting, this will be totally invisible if you use a matching yarn. So I am going to go the rest of the way across using the same method. Come to this front piece, go down through the stitch I was in the last time and up through the next one. and then come back over to this other piece, down through the stitch I was in the last time, and up through the next one. So I'm going to keep doing this all the way across. Alright, so I'm almost to the end. I've got 2 stitches left on the top, so I got to come down through the one I went into the last time, and up through the next one. And then at the bottom, I've got to come down through the one I went into the last time, and up through the next one. And then since this is the end, and I still have a stitch up here that I've only been through once, which is that last one that I went into the last time, I'm just going to bring my needle down through that stitch. So that is the end of our grafting. You can see our nice, neat, darker green knit row that goes through the middle. And now we get to do the big reveal. Before you do this part, check and make sure all of your stitches are not twisted. If they are, you will be able to see it, because one of your stitches either here or here will be, it'll cross, the legs of the stitch will cross over each other instead of just being V-shaped. So as long as you can see, look along here, make sure you don't have any twisted stitches, and make sure that all of your grafting stitches are nice and even. Go ahead and take the waste yarn and just pull it out. And there we have our finished graft. Now I like to give this a little bit of a stretch just to kind of try to even it out, make sure that it is as even as it can get. And that is our finished grafted piece. So we have just joined 2 swatches together, 2 rows of live stitches together, without having to do the Kitchener stitch at all. I personally don't mind the Kitchener stitch too much, but I like this method a lot better because it's just easier on the brain to try to remember how to do it. The Kitchener stitch, you have to do this whole rigmarole of which way you're supposed to insert the needle and which needle you're supposed to insert into as far as the stitch on it. And that can get a little confusing, especially if you have to put it down in the middle of your grafting and pick it back up later. Whereas with this method, all you have to do is just go back to the last stitch you worked into on that piece, go down through that one and up through the next one, come back to this side, go down through the last stitch you worked into and up through the next one. And it just makes it a lot easier to keep it all straight as you're grafting. So if this were a real project, I would go ahead and take my tails, the yarn tails that are coming off of this, and tie them off securely and weave them in, and that would make my edges nice and neat. Right now they're a little sloppy because everything is kind of loose on the ends since I am not tying this off. And also my pieces are curling here because I did not work any kind of preventative edging. I just did straight stockinette stitch just so you can see the grafting more clearly. So as I mentioned before, that little half stitch offset is really not that noticeable. Part of it is hidden in the curl, and unless you are doing a stitch pattern, that will not be a problem at all. So if you are needing to graft something in pattern, the easiest way to do it is just to work a little band of stockinette stitch on both pieces before you graft them, and that will give you a nice little extra detail, but it will also give you a nice clean place to graft without interrupting any of your stitch pattern. So you can use this method of grafting any place a pattern calls for the Kitchener stitch, whether you're working with flat pieces or in the round, doesn't really matter. Just thread both sides onto the waste yarn and graft them with this method without the needles, and it will be a lot easier for you. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know if you have ever tried grafting your knitting in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.